My grandpa was two people, and I spent 20 years trying to keep them from meeting. But then I fell in love, and suddenly their collision became unavoidable. My grandpa was two people, and I spent the first 20 years of my life trying to keep them from meeting. There was Grandpa Joe, the man who taught me how to whittle a piece of pine into a wobbly-looking bird, the one whose workshop smelled of sawdust and old coffee. He'd lift me up to pick the highest apples from his tree, his hands, calloused and strong, making me feel like the safest girl in the world. He was the one who'd slip me a $20 bill before I went back to college, whispering, "Don't tell your grandmother." That was the grandpa I loved with every fiber of my being. Then there was the other one, the one who watched the evening news with a scowl etched onto his face, muttering about "those people" and the way the country was going to hell. This grandpa's voice would drop an octave when a car with loud music drove by our quiet suburban street. He'd tell jokes that made my mom's smile tighten and my dad suddenly find something fascinating to look at on the ceiling. We all had our own coping mechanisms. My dad would clear his throat loudly and change the subject. My mom would start aggressively clearing plates, whether we were finished or not. And I would just shrink, feeling a hot, creeping shame that started in my stomach and spread through my chest. For years this was our dance, a carefully choreographed routine to manage the ugly side of a man we all, for our own reasons, desperately loved. The dance became a lot harder to perform when I met David. David was everything. He was kind, brilliant, funny, and he looked at me in a way that made me feel like I was the only person in the room. He was a third-year medical student with a passion for pediatric oncology and a smile that could disarm armies. He was also black. For the first 6 months of our relationship, I built a wall around him, a protective barrier made of excuses. "Oh, Sunday dinners are just a really boring family thing," I'd say. Or, "My grandpa's not feeling well. We should probably skip it this week." David, being the patient and understanding person he is, never pushed, but I knew the clock was ticking. I was falling deeply in love with him, and I couldn't keep the most important man in my present away from the most important man from my past forever. So, I finally did it. I made the call. "Mom," I said, my voice trembling slightly, "I'm bringing David to Sunday dinner." There was a pause on the other end of the line, so heavy I could feel its weight. "Oh," she finally said. "Okay, honey. That's great." But I could hear the silent plea in her voice. "Please, just let this go smoothly." The day arrived with a knot of pure dread in my stomach. David, sensing my anxiety, squeezed my hand as we pulled up to the familiar brick house. "Hey," he said softly. "It's going to be okay. They're your family. They love you." I wanted to believe him. I really did. The initial introductions were fine. My mom was gushingly enthusiastic. My dad was firm with his handshake and genuinely warm. David, true to form, was effortlessly charming. He talked to my dad about sports, complimented my mom's famous roast chicken, and even got my usually shy younger cousin to show him her rock collection. I watched from the corner of the dining room, my heart a frantic bird in my ribs, my eyes darting towards the living room where my grandpa sat in his worn leather armchair, watching us. He hadn't stood up. He hadn't said a word. When we finally sat down to eat, the air was thick with unspoken tension. I placed David next to me, a silent physical declaration of solidarity. My grandpa sat at the head of the table, his gaze fixed on his plate. He answered David's polite questions with monosyllabic grunts. "How are you, sir?" "Fine. Lily tells me you have an amazing workshop." "Yep." The silence was deafening, broken only by the clinking of silverware. Then my dad, bless his heart, tried to break the ice. "So, David, you're at the city hospital, right? Big place. See a lot of crazy things there, I bet." David smiled. "It's definitely never boring. We had a really tough case come into the ER last week. A little girl." Before he could finish, my grandpa looked up, his pale blue eyes cold as ice chips. He wasn't looking at David, but at me. "Crime's getting bad in that part of the city," he said, his voice a low rumble. "They're letting just anyone in these days, not like it used to be. You have to be careful who you associate with, Lily. You never know what kind of trouble they'll bring to your door." The fork slipped from my hand and clattered onto my plate. Every head at the table snapped towards him. The implication was as clear and as sharp as a shard of glass. He wasn't talking about crime. He wasn't talking about the city. He was talking about the man sitting next to me. David's smile faltered, just for a second, before he composed himself, his expression becoming a mask of polite neutrality. But I saw it. I saw the flash of hurt in his eyes, and in that moment, something inside me broke. All the years of shrinking, of changing the subject, of making excuses for this man. It all evaporated, replaced by a cold, searing rage. The dinner was over. We made our excuses and left in a suffocating silence. The drive back to my apartment was a blur of tears and apologies. David held my hand, telling me it wasn't my fault, but his words were just noise. The only thing I could hear was my grandpa's voice, dripping with a poison I had ignored for too long. When I dropped David off, he held my face in his hands. "I love you, Lily. We'll figure this out." But as I drove away, I knew we couldn't figure this out. This was on me. I couldn't build a future with David on a foundation cracked by my family's hate. Something had to change, and I was the only one who could change it. I didn't drive home. Instead, I found myself turning the car around, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, heading straight back to my grandpa's house. I walked in without knocking. He was right where I knew he'd be, sitting in his armchair, the television off, the room dark except for a single lamp. He looked up as I entered, his face unreadable. I walked to the center of the room, my heart pounding a furious rhythm against my ribs, and stood before him. "Grandpa," I said, my voice shaking but clear, "we need to talk. There's a story I have to tell you, a story about me from a long time ago. And you're going to sit there, and you're going to listen." He stared at me, his jaw set in a stubborn line. For a moment, I thought he was going to order me out of his house. The silence stretched, thin and brittle, until he gave a short, sharp nod, sinking back into the worn leather of his chair. It wasn't permission, not really. It was a challenge. "Go on then, girl. Let's see what you've got." I took a shaky breath, the air tasting of dust and old memories, and began. "I was 16, I said, my voice barely a whisper at first, then gaining strength. It was the summer before junior year. My friend Sarah and I told our parents we were going to the movies, but we weren't. We took the train into the city to go to a concert. A band you've never heard of, in a venue I couldn't find on a map now, if I tried. It was stupid, I know. We were kids being reckless." I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not anger, but a familiar protective clenching of his jaw. He hated the city. He always said nothing good happened there after dark. "The concert was amazing," I continued, forcing myself to remember every detail. "It ended late, around 11. We were supposed to catch the last train back, but the crowd was huge, and in the chaos, I got separated from Sarah. I tried calling her, but my phone was dead. I had no idea where I was, no idea how to get back to the station. Every street looked the same, dark and empty. I started to panic, Grandpa. Real, ice in my veins panic. I let that sink in, watching his face. His expression was still hard, but his knuckles were white where he gripped the arms of his chair. I was walking, trying to find a main road, when a car slowed down beside me. There were 4 guys inside. They started catcalling me, shouting things. I ignored them. I just walked faster, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. But they pulled over ahead of me and got out. They blocked the sidewalk. They were laughing. My voice cracked, and I had to stop and swallow hard. I hadn't told this story to anyone. Not my parents, not my friends, not even David. The shame and fear were still so raw, it felt like it happened yesterday. "They circled me," I said, my voice low and flat. "They were saying what they were going to do. I was so scared I couldn't even scream. I just stood there, frozen, thinking this was it, thinking about Mom and Dad, about you and Grandma, and how I was never going to see you again because of one stupid, reckless decision." My grandpa made a sound, a low growl deep in his chest. His eyes were locked on mine, and for the first time the coldness was gone, replaced by a raw, vicarious terror. And then a man appeared. He came out of the shadows of an apartment building doorway. He wasn't big or intimidating. He was just a man, wearing a security guard's uniform, probably on his way home from a late shift. He was black, Grandpa. I said the words slowly, deliberately, watching them land. He saw what was happening, and he didn't hesitate. He didn't cross the street or pretend he didn't see. He walked right up to them. He had this deep, calm voice. He just said, "Leave the girl alone. Go on home." The guys laughed at him at first. They started pushing him, calling him every name you can imagine. Names you've probably used, Grandpa. But he just stood there, between them and me, and he didn't back down. He said it again. "I'm not going to ask you a third time." Something in his voice, his stillness. I don't know. It scared them. They muttered a few more things, and then they got back in their car and drove off. I was crying now, silent tears tracking down my cheeks. The memory was so vivid I could almost smell the city street, the scent of rain on hot asphalt. He turned to me. I was shaking so hard I couldn't stand. He took off his jacket and put it around my shoulders. He asked me if I was okay, if they had hurt me. He walked me 3 blocks to a 24-hour diner, bought me a cup of hot chocolate, and let me use his phone to call a taxi. He wouldn't let me pay him back. He waited with me until the cab arrived, and before I got in, he just looked at me and said, "You be careful now, little sister. The world's got enough trouble without you looking for it." I never even got his name. I just remember his face. He had kind eyes and a small white scar that cut through his left eyebrow. I finished, my chest heaving with the effort of holding it all together. The room was utterly still. The only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, a sound that had been the backdrop to my entire childhood. My grandpa hadn't moved. He was staring at the floor, his face pale, his expression completely blank. I thought I had failed. I thought he hadn't heard a word, that his hate was a wall too thick for any story to penetrate. I felt a wave of despair wash over me. Then he slowly lifted his head. His eyes, which had been filled with rage and terror moments before, now held a look of utter, bewildering shock. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a rough, strangled whisper, so quiet I almost didn't hear it. "Lily," he rasped, his gaze boring into me. "This man, the security guard, did he have a slight limp? In his right leg?" The question hung in the air, so specific and so unexpected that it knocked the breath right out of me. A limp! I scrambled through the fog of my memory, the image of the man solidifying in my mind, the dark uniform, the kind eyes, the scent of his jacket that smelled faintly of cinnamon gum. I saw him standing under the streetlight, watching my taxi pull away. And then I saw it, the almost imperceptible drag of his right foot as he turned to walk back into the shadows. It was a detail so small, so insignificant compared to the terror of the night, that I had buried it completely. But now, with my grandpa's words echoing in the silent room, it came back with startling clarity. "Yes," I breathed, the word coming out shaky and uncertain. "Yes, he did. How could you possibly know that?" My grandpa's face seemed to collapse. The hard lines, the stubborn set of his jaw, the years of anger etched around his mouth. It all just fell away. He looked suddenly older, frailer, like a statue that had been weathered by a sudden, violent storm. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, and buried his face in his large, calloused hands. A sound came from him, a ragged, choked sob that seemed to be ripped from the deepest part of his soul. I had never seen my grandpa cry, not when my grandmother's sister died, not when he had to put his beloved old dog down. Seeing him break like this was like watching a mountain crumble into dust. "Grandpa?" I asked, taking a hesitant step forward. "What is it? What's wrong?" He didn't answer for a long time. He just sat there, his broad shoulders shaking. The grandfather clock in the hall ticked on, marking the seconds of this strange, terrible new reality. Finally, he lifted his head. His eyes were red-rimmed and filled with a pain so profound it made my own chest ache in sympathy. "That man," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. His name was Charles Evans. He spoke the name like a prayer or a curse. And he wasn't just a security guard, Lily. He was a soldier. He was in my unit. I sank onto the ottoman at his feet, my legs suddenly unable to hold me. The story I had carried alone for so long was suddenly, impossibly, intersecting with a part of my grandpa's life I knew almost nothing about. He never spoke of his time in the army. It was a locked room in the house of his past, and none of us had ever dared to knock. "We were just kids," he whispered, his gaze fixed on some point in the distant past. 18, 19 years old, scared out of our minds, trying to pretend we were tough. Charles, he was the real deal. He was quiet, but everyone looked up to him. He was brave in a way I never was. He was always looking out for the rest of us, especially the new guys. Always had a spare ration, an extra pair of dry socks. A calm word when things got bad. He took a shuddering breath. There was a night we were on patrol. It was pitch black, raining so hard you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. We walked right into an ambush. It was chaos, just noise and flashes of light. I got hit. In the leg. I went down, and I couldn't get up. The rest of the unit was pulling back, falling back to the line. It was protocol. You don't risk the squad for one man down. He looked at me then, his eyes pleading for understanding. I was terrified, Lily. I thought I was going to die right there, bleeding out in the mud 1,000,000 miles from home. And then I saw him. Charles. He was coming back for me. Under heavy fire, everyone screaming at him to get back. But he just ignored them. He half carried, half dragged me over his shoulder all the way back to the trench. He pointed to his own right leg, hidden beneath his trousers. "The limp," he said, his voice cracking. "The doctor said the shrapnel that hit me should have taken my leg off, but Charles was so fast he got me back and they saved it. But while he was pulling me into the trench, he took a round in his own leg. A bad one. It shattered his knee. It ended his career. It gave him that limp he carried for the rest of his life. He saved my life, Lily, and he paid for it." The pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture so horrifying and so tragic I could barely comprehend it. The man who saved me from the worst night of my life was the same man my grandpa owed his own life to. A man whose sacrifice he had seemingly forgotten, or worse, willfully ignored, because of the color of his skin. What happened to him, Grandpa?" I asked softly. "After the army?" My grandpa's face hardened again, but this time the anger was directed inward, a look of self-loathing so potent it was painful to watch. "We both came home," he said grimly. "I got a parade, a hero's welcome. I used my GI Bill, got a good job, bought this house. I got my life back. Charles, he came home to a different America. People spat on him, called him names. He couldn't get a decent job because of his leg, because of his face. We tried to stay in touch for a while, but my world was moving forward and his was stuck. It was easier to just let it go, to forget. I told myself he'd be fine. I told myself there was nothing I could do. He looked down at his hands, the same hands that had taught me how to whittle, that had held me when I was sick, and they were trembling. The last time I saw him was almost 30 years ago. I saw him on the street downtown. He was wearing a security guard's uniform. I almost called out to him. But I was with some guys from work, and I was ashamed. Ashamed of him. Ashamed of me. So I just turned and walked away. I let my hero, the man who saved my life, walk right by me because I was a coward. The confession filled the room, heavy and suffocating. It explained so much, and yet it explained nothing. It was the why, the rotten root of the prejudice I had witnessed my entire life. Not just a vague, free-floating bigotry, but a specific, targeted poison born from his own shame and cowardice. He had spent 50 years burying the memory of the black man who was a better soldier, a better man than he was, and that guilt had curdled into hate. He hated those people because he hated himself, and I had just shown him that the man he had abandoned, the man whose heroism he had tried to erase, had spent his life continuing to be a hero, that he had stepped out of the shadows with that same leg my grandpa had indirectly ruined to save his granddaughter. A sudden chilling thought pierced through my shock. My grandpa was talking about Charles in the past tense. "Grandpa," I said, my voice barely audible. "Where is Charles now?" He slowly raised his eyes to meet mine, and the look in them was one of utter devastation. "That's just it, Lily," he whispered, his voice breaking completely. "I don't know. For all I know, he could be dead. And I never got to say thank you. I never got to say, I'm sorry." The confession hung in the air between us, a ghost that had haunted our family for 50 years. In that moment, the anger I had felt walking into the house evaporated, replaced by a profound and aching sadness. The racist grandpa I had despised and the warm-hearted grandpa I adored were finally the same person, and the reason was more tragic than I could ever have imagined. His prejudice wasn't born of simple hate, but of a deep, festering shame. It was a shield he had built to protect himself from the memory of his own cowardice. "We have to find him," I said, the words coming out with a certainty that surprised me. "Grandpa, we have to try." He looked at me, his face a mask of despair. "How, Lily? It's been decades. I don't know where he lived, who his family was. Charles Evans. There must be thousands of them." "But not thousands who were in your unit," I countered, my mind starting to race. "Not thousands with a white scar through their left eyebrow and a limp in their right leg who worked as a security guard in the city. You have records, don't you? Your army stuff." A flicker of hope ignited in his eyes. He stood up, moving with a purpose I hadn't seen in him for years, and led me to his workshop in the basement. The familiar smell of sawdust and coffee was now mixed with the musty scent of the past. From a dusty footlocker in the corner, he pulled out a faded green scrapbook. Inside were yellowed newspaper clippings and black and white photos of young men with old eyes posing in front of jeeps and tents. And there he was, a handsome, serious-looking young black man, standing shoulder to shoulder with a skinny, grinning version of my grandpa. Beneath the photo, a caption was typed, "PFC, Joseph Miller, and CPL, Charles Evans." That night we didn't sleep. We launched a full-scale investigation from his kitchen table. We scoured online military archives, veterans forums, and public records. The search felt hopeless at first, a single name in a sea of millions. But with the details we had, the unit, the approximate age, the injury, we slowly started to build a trail. By sunrise, fueled by endless cups of coffee, we found something. An obituary from 7 years ago. Charles Evans, survived by his loving wife Mary and his son David. My blood ran cold. "David," I whispered, my heart pounding against my ribs. "Grandpa, my David. He's a medical student. His father was a security guard who passed away a few years ago. He told me he was named after a friend his dad had in the army, who he lost touch with, someone named Joe." My grandpa stared at me, his mouth agape, the pieces of our two separate worlds colliding with the force of a tectonic shift. The kind eyes, the calm demeanor, the innate decency. David was his father's son. The universe, in its strange and inscrutable way, had brought the son of the man who saved my grandpa's life to the granddaughter he saved years later. Making that phone call was the hardest thing I've ever had to do. I tried to explain, my words stumbling over each other, the story sounding too insane, too much like a movie to possibly be real. But David listened patiently, and when I finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "My mom has a picture," he finally said, his voice thick with emotion, "of my dad and his army buddy Joe. He's been on our mantelpiece my entire life." 2 days later, we were standing on the doorstep of a neat little house in a quiet neighborhood I had never been to. My grandpa was wearing his best suit, clutching a bouquet of roses so tightly his knuckles were white. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him, terrified. I squeezed his hand, and David, standing beside me, squeezed mine. David's mother, Mary, a woman with a gentle face and her son's kind eyes, opened the door. She looked from David to me and then to my grandpa. Her expression softened with a dawning recognition. "Joe," she whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. "Joseph Miller?" My grandpa just nodded, unable to speak, his eyes already welling with tears. She led us into a living room filled with family photos, and there, on the mantelpiece, was the picture from the scrapbook. Mary and Grandpa Joe sat on the sofa, and the stories poured out of them. She told him how Charles had spoken of him often, always wondering what had become of his friend, how he never held a grudge, How he understood that the world back then had been complicated. Finally, my grandpa looked at her, his face etched with 50 years of regret. "Mary," he said, his voice raw, "I was a coward. Your husband was the bravest man I ever knew, and I abandoned him. I let my shame and this poison in the world turn me into a bitter old man. I was so wrong, and I am so, so sorry." Mary reached out and took his hand. "Charles was a man who believed in second chances, Joe," she said softly. "He would have forgiven you. And he would be so proud," she added, her gaze falling on David and me, our hands still intertwined, "to see that the goodness he put into the world found its way back. Full circle." That day something in my grandpa broke open and began to heal. The bitterness that had clung to him for so long began to recede, washed away by the tide of truth and forgiveness. He wasn't a different person overnight. Decades of ingrained prejudice don't just vanish, but he was trying. He started asking questions instead of making pronouncements. He started listening. He would watch the news with David, asking him to explain things from his perspective. He treated David not just with respect, but with a deep, reverent affection, seeing in him the legacy of the friend he had wronged. Our Sunday dinners are different now. They're louder, filled with more laughter. The carefully choreographed dance of avoidance is gone, replaced by a messy, beautiful, and sometimes awkward attempt at real connection. Last week I walked into the workshop to find Grandpa Joe and David bent over the workbench, their heads close together. My grandpa was showing David how to whittle a piece of pine, his gnarled hands guiding David's. He was carving a wobbly-looking bird, and for the first time in my life, I knew, with absolute certainty, that there was only one grandpa, and I loved him with every fiber of my being.